There is a moment in a man's life when the person he trusted the most becomes the person who destroys him. Not a stranger, not an enemy, someone he chose, someone he built something with, someone who sat across the table from him, shook his hand, and looked him in the eye, and all the while knew exactly what was coming. That moment arrived for Robert T. Brockman on October 15, 2020. On that day, the United States Department of Justice walked to a podium in Washington, D.C. and announced something that stunned the financial world. The man behind what they called the largest individual tax evasion case in American history was not some shadowy offshore financier. He was a 79-year-old software billionaire from Houston, Texas, who had spent decades building one of the most quietly powerful business empires in the country. And the man who handed him over to the government, the man who agreed to cooperate and tell prosecutors everything, was the very person Robert Brockman had made a billionaire. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened between Robert Brockman and Robert F. Smith, you first have to understand who these men were, where they came from, and why the bond between them looked, from the outside, like one of the most remarkable stories in American business. Because on the surface, this was a story of generosity, of an older man recognizing the brilliance of a younger one and giving him the tools to change his own destiny. The problem, according to federal investigators, is that the tools came with strings attached, and those strings would eventually pull both men directly into the largest tax fraud investigation the United States government had ever launched against a single individual. Robert Theron Brockman was born on May 28, 1941, in St. Petersburg, Florida. His father ran a gas station. His mother worked as a physiotherapist. There was no inherited wealth, no family name that opened doors. What Brockman had was something that could not be bought or borrowed, an almost obsessive understanding of how businesses worked and an instinct for seeing opportunity where other people only saw complexity. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Florida in 1963. He worked at IBM as a salesman and became, by most accounts, one of the best in the country. And then, in 1970, sitting in his living room in Houston, Texas, he started a company from scratch called Universal Computer Systems. The idea was simple. Car dealerships needed software to manage their operations, and nobody was giving it to them. Brockman would. That single insight, executed with relentless focus over 30 years, would eventually make him a billionaire several times over. By the time his name appeared in headlines in 2020, his fortune was estimated by Forbes at $4.7 billion, and his company, by then renamed Reynolds and Reynolds, was one of the most dominant automotive software providers in the United States. But for all his wealth, almost nobody outside of the business world had ever heard of Robert Brockman. That was deliberate. He gave almost no interviews. He lived quietly in Houston. He refused public attention in a way that was almost conspicuous for a man of his means. According to those who knew him well, Brockman was precise, controlled, and deeply private. He liked fly fishing. He owned a compound on the Frying Pan River in Colorado where he spent his summers. He was a man who constructed his world with great care, and he expected that world to remain exactly as he had arranged it. Robert Frederick Smith was, in almost every way, the opposite of Brockman in terms of public presence. Born on December 1, 1962, in Denver, Colorado, Smith grew up in a middle-class African-American neighborhood on the east side of the city. His father was a school principal. His mother held a PhD in education. They were a family that believed deeply in the power of learning, and that belief shaped everything Smith would later become. As a high schooler, he applied for an internship at Bell Labs and was told the program was only for college students. He called them every week until they gave him a slot. That quality, the refusal to accept the first no, would define his entire career. Smith went on to study chemical engineering at Cornell, then earned his MBA from Columbia Business School. He took a job at Goldman Sachs in mergers and acquisitions, where he specialized in enterprise software, a sector that most of his colleagues found unglamorous. Smith found it extraordinary. He could see, in ways that other analysts had not, that software companies with large numbers of paying subscribers generated income that was as reliable and predictable as any annuity in the financial world. He spent 6 years at Goldman developing this thesis, building a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in the technology investment space. And then he met Robert Brockman. According to court documents and reporting by the Washington Post, the two men first connected in 1997. Smith was a young investment banker still working at Goldman. Brockman was already a billionaire, watching the technology sector with great interest from his base in Houston. They quickly found common ground. Smith was enthralled by what Brockman had built with Universal Computer Systems, the idea of taking over software companies, improving them with disciplined operational principles, and holding them for the long term rather than flipping them quickly. Brockman, according to those present in those early conversations, was equally impressed by Smith's intellect and his vision for how enterprise software could be deployed as a private equity strategy. The older man saw something in the younger one that he believed was rare. And so, in the year 2000, Robert Brockman made Robert F. Smith an offer that almost defied belief. He would stake Smith's new private equity firm with $1 billion. Smith would have his own fund, his own firm, and the resources to execute the strategy he had spent years developing at Goldman. The firm became Vista Equity Partners. And from that foundation, built on Brockman's capital, Smith would go on to become the wealthiest black person in the United States of America. But according to federal prosecutors, that $1 billion was not simply a generous gift between two men who admired each other. Investigators alleged that woven into the structure of that arrangement were requirements, allegedly discussed and agreed upon, that the returns on Brockman's investment would flow not into transparent accounts where the IRS could see them, but into a web of offshore entities and foreign bank accounts deliberately designed to keep the income hidden. Smith later admitted to investigators that the offshore structure had been part of the deal from the beginning, though Vista Equity Partners itself was never charged with any wrongdoing. What this means, according to the government's case, is that from the very moment the two men shook hands and agreed to build something together, the seeds of the eventual reckoning were already planted. For nearly 20 years, according to the 39-count federal indictment unsealed in October 2020, Robert Brockman ran what investigators described as the most sophisticated individual tax evasion scheme in American history. The numbers alone are staggering. Prosecutors alleged that Brockman had concealed approximately $2 billion in income from the Internal Revenue Service over a period spanning 2 decades. $2 billion. Hidden not through simple accounting tricks or overlooked paperwork, but through what investigators called a deliberate, layered, and meticulously constructed system of deception that stretched across multiple countries and involved dozens of offshore entities. According to the indictment, Brockman used offshore companies registered in Bermuda and the island of Nevis in the Caribbean to shield the income earned on his investment in Vista Equity Partners. He maintained secret bank accounts in Bermuda and Switzerland. He reportedly purchased a Colorado fishing lodge on the Frying Pan River, a 143-acre compound where he spent his summers casting lines into some of the country's best trout streams, using funds that investigators allege were never reported to the IRS. He purchased a $29 million luxury yacht, which he named, perhaps with a degree of irony that is difficult to ignore, the Turmoil. He bought homes in France, California, and Colorado, all allegedly paid for with income that the government says he had deliberately placed beyond its reach. But what made this case truly extraordinary, what made it read, as CNN reported at the time, more like a screenplay than a federal indictment, was the level of operational care that investigators alleged Brockman brought to his concealment. He did not simply move money and hope nobody noticed. According to court filings, he created an entire encrypted communications infrastructure so that those who helped him manage his offshore network could correspond without generating records that investigators might one day find. He used code names throughout. He reportedly called himself Permit. Associates were assigned names drawn from the world of fish, bonefish, snapper, redfish, steelhead. The IRS itself was referred to in communications as the House. A single large transaction of $634 million was given the name Hot Rod. According to prosecutors, Brockman on one occasion invited a wealth manager to attend what was described as a money laundering conference under an assumed identity. That same manager was later allegedly asked to destroy evidence, not through a discrete deletion of digital files, but physically, using shredders and hammers. The IRS Criminal Investigation Chief, Jim Lee, stood before the press in 2020 and said something that stopped many people cold. He said, "Dollar amounts aside, I have not seen this pattern of greed or concealment and cover-up in my 25-plus years as a special agent." Now here is where the story takes the turn that nobody fully anticipated. Because to bring a case of this complexity to trial, the Department of Justice needed someone on the inside. Someone who had participated in the offshore structure. Someone who could walk into a courtroom and explain, from direct personal knowledge, exactly how the system had worked and who had known what. And the person they found, the person who agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for avoiding his own prosecution, was Robert F. Smith, the man whose billion-dollar company had been built on Brockman's capital, the man whose entire financial empire rested on that 1997 handshake in Houston. In October 2020, the Department of Justice announced that Robert F. Smith had entered into a non-prosecution agreement. As part of that agreement, Smith admitted to having evaded taxes himself on income connected to offshore structures tied to his arrangement with Brockman. He agreed to pay $139 million in back taxes and penalties to settle what investigators called one of the largest individual tax evasion cases ever resolved in American history. And he agreed to cooperate fully with the government's case against Robert Brockman, the man who had given Smith everything. The capital, the platform, the foundation of his entire career, was now going to be prosecuted with Smith's help. The announcement landed in the financial world like a thunderclap. Those who had watched the relationship between the two men for years struggled to reconcile what they were reading with the story they thought they knew. Smith had, by 2020, become one of the most celebrated philanthropists in America. He had donated $20 million to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. He had pledged to pay off the entire student debt of the graduating class at Morehouse College, a gesture that had made national news and brought audiences to their feet. He had given to cancer research, to Carnegie Hall, to national parks. He had become, in the public imagination, a symbol of extraordinary generosity. And now, according to federal documents, the fortune that had funded all of that generosity had been built on a structure that investigators alleged was illegal from its very foundation. Robert Brockman pleaded not guilty. His legal team began preparing what they believed would be a vigorous defense. But almost immediately, a parallel fight opened, one that would ultimately prevent the case from ever reaching a jury. Brockman's attorneys filed motions arguing that their client was suffering from a rapidly deteriorating case of dementia that rendered him incapable of assisting in his own defense and therefore incompetent to stand trial. This claim became one of the most contested legal battles of the entire case. Prosecutors were deeply skeptical. They pointed to the extraordinary sophistication of the alleged scheme, the careful use of code names, the deliberate destruction of evidence, the construction of layered offshore structures that had apparently operated without a flaw for nearly 20 years, and questioned how such a scheme could have been designed and maintained by someone whose mental faculties were now allegedly so compromised. A federal judge ordered mental health evaluations. The case moved through a protracted competency hearing. In May 2022, Judge George C. Hanks Jr. of the Southern District of Texas ruled that Brockman was mentally competent to stand trial and set a trial date for February of the following year. It appeared, at that point, that the reckoning was finally coming. That Robert F. Smith would take the witness stand. That the full story, the offshore accounts, the code names, the hammers and shredders, the 2 decades of alleged concealment, would finally be laid out in a federal courtroom for the world to hear. It never happened. On August 5, 2022, Robert T. Brockman passed away at his home in Houston. He was 81 years old. His attorney confirmed the death the following day. The cause was not immediately disclosed, though it was known that he had been receiving care for dementia in the final months of his life. With his death, the criminal case against him was formally closed. Robert F. Smith would never be required to testify in open court. The full details of what investigators alleged, the complete architecture of the offshore structure, the internal communications, the extent of the coordination, would never be tested before a jury. The case that had been described by prosecutors as the largest individual tax evasion scheme in American history ended not with a verdict, but with a death. The government did not, however, walk away empty-handed. Federal prosecutors pursued the case against Brockman's estate. His heirs fought the government's claims for years. And then, in December 2025, a final settlement was reached. Brockman's estate agreed to pay $750 million to the United States government. That figure, $456 million in back taxes and $294 million in penalties, represented the largest settlement of its kind ever recorded in American history in a case involving a single individual. The government had won. But the man at the center of it all was gone, and the courtroom confrontation that might have answered so many questions never came. There is something about the Carlos Kepke chapter of this story that deserves its own moment, because it quietly expands what was already an almost incomprehensible tale. Carlos Kepke was an 81-year-old Houston attorney who prosecutors alleged had played a key role in helping Robert Smith establish the offshore structure that gave rise to his tax evasion. According to reporting by Axios and the Daily Beast, Smith's cooperation agreement with the Department of Justice had identified two individuals of interest: Brockman, referred to as Individual A, and Kepke, referred to as Individual B. Kepke was indicted in 2021 on charges related to his alleged role in the scheme. His trial was scheduled to begin on a Monday in December 2022. And then, on the Sunday before that trial was to begin, according to investigators, Carlos Kepke took his own life. He was 80 years old. His trial never began. Smith, who had been listed as a scheduled witness in the case, would not need to take the stand. Within the span of a little over 2 years, both of the men whose testimony might have most thoroughly illuminated the inner workings of the alleged scheme were gone, one by death from illness, one by his own hand, before either trial concluded. The attorneys representing Kepke, in filings submitted just before his death, had indicated that their defense strategy was going to include a close examination of Smith's own claims of innocence, questioning whether Smith had been truthful with prosecutors and whether his original assertions about the offshore structure were credible. Whether that defense would have succeeded, nobody can now say. What is certain is that it never had the chance to be heard. Robert F. Smith emerged from the entire episode in a position that many observers found remarkable. He had admitted to serious tax violations. He had agreed to pay $139 million. He had cooperated against the man who gave him his start. And yet, within the private equity world, his firm Vista Equity Partners continued to operate at the highest levels. According to a New York Times analysis at the time, Vista's investors barely reacted. The firm had been transparent with its limited partners from the moment the investigation became known, alerting them before the news broke publicly, a move that minimized the element of surprise and allowed investor confidence to remain largely intact. Vista's track record of returns, with an average annual rate of return reported at above 30% across its funds, provided a financial buffer that purely legal or reputational trouble might have otherwise eroded. Smith remained in place as chairman and CEO. As of 2025, his net worth was estimated by Forbes at $6.7 billion, making him, according to that calculation, the wealthiest black person in the United States. He has declined to comment publicly on either Brockman's death or Kepke's passing. There are layers to this story that demand a moment of stillness. Think about what Robert Brockman did for Robert Smith in the year 2000. He did not have to do it. He was already enormously wealthy. He did not need another investment vehicle or another relationship. By all accounts, the decision to back Smith was driven by genuine admiration, a recognition of rare talent in a young man who had earned everything through his own intelligence and persistence. And yet, if the government's allegations are accurate, that act of generosity came with a condition that would eventually destroy Brockman. Because the offshore structure that prosecutors say was built into the foundation of the Vista deal was, according to investigators, the thread that ultimately unraveled everything. The very arrangement that made Smith a billionaire is also the arrangement that, according to the government, gave them the leverage to bring Brockman's entire financial world crashing down. According to reporting in the Washington Post, Smith described having what he called one of those man-in-the-mirror moments, when he was confronted with the decision of whether to cooperate with prosecutors or face trial himself. He chose to cooperate. He chose, in the language of the government's documents, to agree to assist the Department of Justice in building the case against Robert T. Brockman. The man who had written him $1 billion check and told him to go build something extraordinary. Whether that decision reflected a genuine reckoning with personal responsibility, or whether it was simply a rational calculation made by a man who saw no other path to preserving his freedom and his firm, is a question that only Smith can answer. And Smith has not answered it publicly. What investigators are left with, what history is now left with, is a story that refuses easy conclusions. Robert Brockman built a software empire through genuine talent and relentless work. He also allegedly constructed, according to the government's case, one of the most elaborate and sustained frauds ever perpetrated by an individual against the American tax system. Robert F. Smith built one of the most respected private equity firms in the country, generated extraordinary returns for his investors, and became a philanthropist whose generosity reached thousands of people who will never know his name. He also admitted to participating in an illegal offshore tax structure and agreed to cooperate against the man who made all of it possible. Both things can be true at the same time, and that is what makes this story so deeply uncomfortable. The IRS criminal investigation chief stood before the press in 2020 and described what his agents had found. The yacht named Turmoil, the fishing lodge in Colorado, the hammers and shredders, the code names drawn from fish. 20 years of alleged concealment, sophisticated enough that it operated without detection through multiple IRS administrations, multiple market cycles, and the full span of the digital age. And yet it still ended the way all such stories end, with someone who knew enough and had enough reason to talk. The government ultimately recovered $750 million from Brockman's estate and $139 million from Smith. A total of roughly $900 million returned to the federal treasury from what prosecutors had alleged was a $2 billion scheme. Whether the full picture of what happened between these two men, the complete story of what was agreed to, what was understood, and what was deliberately concealed, will ever be known in its entirety, is now genuinely uncertain. The two trials that might have produced that clarity never happened. The two men whose testimony was expected to illuminate the most sensitive details are both gone. What remains is this: a courtroom that was never used, a verdict that was never delivered, and a question that prosecutors raised in 2020 and that no jury ever formally answered. According to the United States government, the largest individual tax fraud in American history was designed and executed over 20 years by one of the most private and methodical billionaires the country had ever produced, a man who coded himself permit, called the tax authorities the house, and gave a younger man $1 billion to help him build an empire, on terms that investigators say were never meant to be made public. Robert Brockman died before the country could hear his side of that story in full. Whether that was the final act of a life lived with extraordinary control, or simply the way things sometimes end, is something that every person who followed this case will have to decide for themselves. So here is what I want to ask you, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments below. Robert F. Smith admitted to tax evasion, paid $139 million, cooperated against the man who gave him his start, and walked away without ever being charged with a crime. His firm is larger than ever. His reputation, while marked, survived. Robert Brockman died before trial, and his estate eventually settled for $750 million. No one went to prison. Does that feel like justice to you? And when you think about a relationship like the one these two men had, 23 years, $1 billion investment, an empire built together, and you consider how it ended, ask yourself this: at what point does loyalty end and self-preservation begin? And would you have seen the signs? Drop your answer below. I read every single comment. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, you need to see the next one. Because the case we are covering next involves a family that controlled a media empire worth tens of billions of dollars. And the moment a dying patriarch decided to rewrite his will and cut out the child who thought they had earned everything. The fallout destroyed a dynasty, and nobody saw it coming. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it.